Hi Booktube and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads, Jonathan Lethem's Brooklyn crime novel, Perceval Everett, Suder. I have to say that Lethem and Everett are probably the contemporary writers that I've read the most by. I think that's my 11th Everett and 10th or 11th Lethem. Antonio Lobo Antunes, The Natural Order of Things, translated from the Portuguese by Richard Zenith, which is a great name. Andrey Platanov, The Foundation Pit, some Soviet literature. This was translated by Elizabeth Chandler and Olga Mearson. Stephanie LaCava, The Superrationals. Donald Antrim, The Verificationist. Some poetry, Eggshell by Victoria Kenneficke. And finally, A Shining, John Fosse. I've got a separate dedicated review of this, so I won't be talking about this here today, other than to say I gave it 2 stars. I will post the link in my show notes as to my full, where you can view my full review. So I'm going to start with Jonathan Lethem's Brooklyn crime novel. And I think Lethem has now become the author of record of New York. There always seems to be an author in every generation who's primed to, give the literary representation of New York, warts and all, in every one of its facets. So we had Chronic City, which is one of my favourite books of all time, which is a total stoner view of New York. But we had Distant Gardens, which was about the sort of the radical left enclave in New York from the 60s, maybe the 50s onwards. We've had Motherless Brooklyn. And now we have this, Brooklyn, a crime novel. So the first thing to say about this is what voice is written in. It's not directly attributable to a character. Is it Brooklyn itself speaking? Is it a sort of a metafictional author who is only there by sort of implication until towards the end when we get more of a notion who this author is, and that is Jonathan Lethem himself, who I assume grew up in Brooklyn. So it has an interesting voice, it has an interesting tone, because it is addressing the reader directly in places, saying that this is an inquiry into the sort of the criminal nature of growing up in Brooklyn from the 60s onwards until its gentrification in the sort of 80s and 90s. But really, it's an inquiry into the sort of petty criminality of the community and its rules and ethics and codes and sort of behavioural language. He calls it the dance when someone is mugged, that both the mugger and their victim, they both know the roles that they're supposed to enact and the rituals they're supposed to enact. More of which anon. But actually, this is a book about the gentrification of all of New York, but specifically Brooklyn, which I assume is probably one of the last parts, one of the last boroughs to become gentrified. So, as I say, it's about petty crime. We have this kaleidoscope of characters, mainly male. There are just a few female characters, but it's really about male-on-male predation, male-on-male violence, with the extra, sorry, not violence, the intimidation, with the extra layer of race. As I say, we get this whole panoply of characters who are engaged in the dance, whereby you have lots of crime ranging from breaking open a hydrant so that the kids can, bathe in the water, which is technically a crime, to these 2 kids who are bored and they sort of use a hacksaw to saw up nickels and dimes into sort of tiny shards, which is a crime against the currency. You're not allowed to adulterate the currency, but no one's ever going to get prosecuted for that in that way, unless you're doing, massive counterfeiting of banknotes, which these 2 are not. But mainly it's mugging, and it's such an expected thing that the kids there are given what's called mugging money, that they hide most of the money they're carrying on around them for lunch at school or whatever it is. They hide it in their socks, they hide it under the soles of their shoes, and they have this sort of token available dollar in their pocket. That will be the toll, the tax paid up to the Minotaur to cross the road to go through, on their way to school. and it's absolutely expected and demanded. As I say, both sides, both the mugger and the victim, fulfil their role. But it's not just sort of individual on individual crime, it's also housebreaking and property crime. This is, you know, from the 60s, this is a very rundown area. Rooming houses are vacated till they're eventually empty. Storefronts are abandoned. I mean, in Manhattan, you had landlords burning out the properties because the insurance payment was sort of more lucrative than any rents they could make. So this is, you know, it was a real period of sort of urban decay. But in Brooklyn, there were some enterprising individuals who brought up these sort of shells of buildings, and by their own manual labour, they were turning them into what we would now call, you know, sort of gentrified housing. But it would take up to 15 years for them to do it. So the initial people who were doing it were pioneers. But the point that Lethem makes is that gradually became an industry of realtors, investors. Then you get all the shops attracted to these areas, of the ones that provide the antique fireplaces and all the other furnishings. And that's when it turns from sort of one or two people doing it, which you could just about stomach, to an industry, and that changes the whole nature of the neighbourhood. And people are basically getting ripped off and pushed out of the neighbourhood as the you know, property prices grow through the roof and stuff. But they're still in sort of the 60s and 70s. And don't forget, you know, as I say, we associate gentrification with sort of the 80s and 90s and yuppies and all that. No, this started in the 60s, but very sporadic, very ad hoc. As I say, it's only when it gets sort of more industrial scale in the 80s and 90s that it becomes a thing. And there's a very amusing description that Lethem gives of, as I say, it's not just individual on individual crime. It expands to include housebreaking and property theft. There's always been vandalism and graffiti. And he has this amusing part where one gang of housebreakers possess a member who's so small that he can slide through the sort of security grills, so that the people learn from that, and they make sort of more and more sort of security devices with bars and razor wire and all this sort of stuff, which also, so the criminals, they also escalate to match that, and they just sort of do cars that tie to these security things and pull them apart so they can just sort of burst in, which actually creates a lot more damage than the original housebreaker, who just had the skinny guy breaking in. So it's like an escalation in echo of the escalation of the Vietnam War, really. So there are all these, as I say, there are all these crimes, but there's also crimes of taste. There's crimes of changing the community, changing the nature, the organic nature of the community as it's increasingly gentrified. These are crimes that are never really spoken of except by sort of sociologists, rather than crimes in law. The police aren't going to act on it because technically it's not illegal, you know, no laws are being broken. But it's, in a way, it's a crime against a community. That community has been broken up. And that is Lethem's point. And then we come back to this, well, who's narrating this? And one of the characters, who's called the Wheeze, who is one of the original, it's called Dean Street, is the main focus of this part of Brooklyn in the book. He's one of the original Dean Street boys. And whenever he overhears people talking about some place in Brooklyn, like a restaurant or whatever, he sort of out-trumps them by saying, oh yes, but it used to be this, and it used, before that it was, you know, he's basically saying to these people, you're newcomers, you know nothing. You're carpetbaggers. You know, again, the echo from the post-Civil War Reconstruction era. And he could take it all the way back to when it was Native American land, before the Dutch turned it into New Amsterdam and Brooklyn, before the English kicked the Dutch out. Anyway, so the Wheeze is accusing the author, who may or may not be Jonathan Lethem, of the biggest crime of all, is that he gentrifies gentrification, because this is a literary novel, and the mere act of making something literary, i.e. for a restricted audience, is akin to those who have the money and able to, you know, invest in brownstone buildings and repoint them and renew them and restore them. And by sort of not glamorising it, but by representing it, portraying it in literary language with metaphors, the Wheeze is accusing the writer of, as I say, gentrification itself, which I think is a brilliant concept. So this is a book that really takes a big panorama from the 60s to the present day, and it looks at how an area has been changed, how its original rules and codes of practice of the expected muggings, how that's sort of been chased by zero tolerance of Giuliani, and then the people with fewer resources getting chased out of the area by the gentrification anyway. But it's questioning all the time how much of this is mythical, how much of it is a fiction. It's based on real characters, but they are fictionalised in the book. There are all these urban myths, but not sort of the general urban myths, but urban myths specific to Brooklyn of these characters or these incidents and stuff. But how reliable are they? Even one of the areas called Burcombe Hill, something like that, the Wheeze has traced back to say, well, that was a fiction perpetrated by a landowner who bore the name Burcombe, as in Boerkum, from Dutch ancestry. But she came up with this whole sort of mythic founding myth to justify naming that area after her family name. But even that was a myth. So all the time it's interrogating its ability to genuinely portray this huge panorama, even while it's doing it. It's just a really, really clever, satisfying read, I found. Very, very satisfying. And just finally, while the DIY renovations are going on inside the houses, the DIY reparations are transpiring on the sidewalks out front. So that's during the period of slow transition from, the last original, poverty-stricken, ghettoised people of Brooklyn hanging on. They are exuding attacks from the children of the new residents, and which he calls reparations. I just thought this was thoroughly satisfying. It's very different to something like Chronic City, but I'd almost go as far as saying it's Lethem's best because of its ambition and its scope and its interesting voice, which is self-critical all the way through. 5 stars. So, as I say, I've read a lot of Perceval Everett, mainly his more recent books, and this, in fact, was his debut from 1983 or 86, something like that. I was just interested to see how he started out. And Suder is the eponymous hero who plays third base in baseball for the Seattle Mariners, so he's a professional baseball player. He's Afro-American, and at the start of the book he is suffering a real bad slump in form, both in hitting at the plate but also on defence. And unfortunately that seems to extend to in his bed with his wife, where he's suffering a slump on that score. And the book throughout intercuts Suder in the present as this baseball player and his upbringing as a child, where his mum was definitely touched. And Suder, as an adult, is worried that he's going to turn out sort of disturbed as his mother was. But all the time his father says, we're not going to send her to a sanatorium. We're not going to have her locked away. So that he and his brother have a very tough upbringing with this very strange mother of theirs. And as I say, as an adult, he worries that he's going to be as mad as her. Anyway, the coach of his baseball team says, look, you're really stinking the place out. We're going to say you've got an injury and put you on the DL, the disabled list, and that way they can call up another player. And he says, go and have a holiday, go and take a complete break. So Suder is going to visit a retired baseball player from an earlier generation called Bob Willis, who isn't actually Afro-American. He's actually Native American, but everyone, because of his dark skin, just assumed that he was Afro-American. And he was in that first generation of Afro-American ball players to break the colour barrier. And Willis is rather sort of embittered because he feels that because players like Jackie Robinson were such superheroes and such supermen, they had to be in order to break through the colour ban, that the authorities were worried that the public would see these great athletes and say, oh my gosh, all Afro-American athletes are, you know, these sort of giants, these titans. We can't have that, because then they'll become perceived as a superior race. So they chose the likes of Bob Willis as an average player to represent the fact that not all Afro-Americans, even though he's not African-American, were so sort of endowed with, you know, supreme abilities and stuff. So he has this huge chip on his shoulder. And in his retirement, he is dealing drugs, which Suder doesn't know. And they go on a boat trip down towards, I think they're going, I can't remember where it is, but it turns out that it's a drug deal going down on the waterways in America, where they're, you know, whenever this is written, in the 60s or 70s, whatever, sorry, whenever it's set, I should say, not written, you know, there was far less sort of scrutiny. And Suder is appalled by this, and he pushes Willis into the water, makes off with the boat and the money after the exchange, and now has this sort of mad drug kingpin on his tail. So he now hides out in a sort of remote cabin owned by his baseball coach in the Pacific Northwest, and there it becomes sort of quite... He wants really to throw the shackles off. He's not really got any intention to go back to baseball. He's fallen in love with Charlie Parker's track Ornithology, which is the title track from his Ornithology album, and he's bought himself a saxophone. But weird and wonderful things, which I'm not going to go into because they're sort of slight spoilers and stuff. It gets quite surreal in the third part, in this remote cabin. So a lot of the elements of all Everett sort of works are definitely in here. There's humour, there's sort of madcap stuff verging on the surreal, but just pulling back from the surreal. There's racial identity, sort of explorations. It's all in here. I will say that it didn't quite have the brio of something like The Trees or Erasure, but you could definitely see the sort of the early workings and stylings of Perceval Everett. I gave it 4 stars. And on to Antonio Lobo Antunes, The Natural Order of Things. So this was gifted to me by one of my regular subscribers, Bob Black. Bob, thank you very much. This is one of his favourite books. And Antunes, it seems to be a writer who's not that well known. This was published in the 90s. And I can see why Bob loved this. I too fell in love with it, sort of 5 stars. It's about a family. Each section, 2 members, either directly of the family or who have involvement with the family, maybe a partner or a neighbour. So each section has 2 of these characters, and by the end it's all brilliantly knitted together how they fit in. There's no real confusion as to who is who. It's brilliantly modulated. So, for example, the first pair is a 49-year-old man who's managed to get himself married to an 18-year-old girl, and who has diabetes, and she hates everything about her life. She hates the fact she has diabetes. She hates the fact that she's married to this older man. She won't let him touch her. She won't have sex with him. It's a completely sort of loveless marriage. And the second character who weaves in and out of their story is a private detective who's been told to observe this man. We're not sure who by. Then the second part is the father of the woman, who's basically the girl, who's basically pimped her out to this guy. And he's sort of totally insane. He was mining in both Mozambique and South Africa for gold. He seems to have left his mind beneath ground because he constantly wants to return to the tunnels and the darkness and the soil and sweat and soot underground. But he's living in Lisbon. But he attacks certain places with a pickaxe to try and burrow underground, and often has to be sort of restrained. And again, the other character in this initially is this private eye. Then we come to another set of characters, 2 brothers. one of whom is involved in a movement for democracy to unseat the generals who were ruling Portugal at the time. But he's captured and tortured by the military who run the country. And his other brother, who is the sort of the loser of the family, was predicted by the father that he'll never amount to anything, that he'll probably marry his housemaid, which indeed he does, and has always been sort of called an idiot both by his father, both by the older brother who's now being sort of tortured, and he sort of fights back as feebly as he can. But by this stage, and this is the third sort of section, we see how brilliantly Antunes, even within a paragraph, even without a full stop, is sort of, you know, jumping from one of the pair's stories to the other and back again. It's a seamless elision. It works so well. And later on, as we build up more and more characters, he jumps between 2, 3 and 4 characters, as I say, within the same paragraph or the same line. I'd say it's supremely well done. Another one of the characters is a woman, the sister of the mad miner, if we can call him that, who remembers coastal Portugal and this portable movie house cinema screen which projected onto the coastal rocks, but the sound of the sea was so loud it sort of blotted out the soundtrack coming through the loudspeakers, and how her virginity was stolen from her by the guy who ran this portable cinema, and she has a hankering to go back and visit that neck of the sort of coastal Portugal to rediscover and find her childhood that was stolen from her. So all these characters are just brilliantly portrayed. Their relationships and their personal tragedies and traumas are so well done. Normally I'm not a big one for sort of family dramas or sagas, and it strictly isn't a saga at all, because the characters are sort of quite out there, really. But I just thought the control as we went from colonial Mozambique to modern day Lisbon under the generals, as was when this book was set, to coastal Portugal, I just thought it was seamless and effortlessly done. Obviously, it's not effort; a lot of effort has gone into it, but it was wonderful. 5 stars. Now, Platanov's The Foundation Pit. So I had to revise my view on this. When I finished reading it, I thought, yeah, you know, ho-hum, 3 stars. But it stayed with me and it worked me over, and actually I've upgraded it to 4 stars. It's about the forced collectivisation of the farms under Stalin, which, you know, was a cause of terrible death and starvation and sort of just general absolute sort of cataclysmic disaster. But it starts off with a manual labouring group who are representatives of the proletariat digging this pit, the eponymous foundation pit, for the foundations for a new block of housing to house members of the proletariat in, and they're just sort of digging and digging and digging. And I was slightly confused at that point as to which character was which character represented, you know, those that were sort of, you know, absolutely on board with the regime, those who were cadres, those who were sort of inside their heads were opposed to it. I got a bit lost, but then it moves into the village, and that's where it really begins to work, I feel. There's a little girl who's orphaned. She's found sort of cradling her mother as her mother is dying in an abandoned warehouse. And these labourers adopt her. And she's the most sort of fiercely pro-Stalin character of them all, with this little girl, and becomes a symbol of sort of Stalinism, you know, through the acidity and acerbity of her mouth. And why it worked on me, sort of after I'd finished reading it, was, you know, the notes in the back are very important, I feel, because you know, a lot of words taken directly from Stalin's mouth as he was trying to make this policy work. He was trying to get the cadre to enforce collectivisation. He was trying to persuade the kulaks, who were the property-owning farmers, to surrender to the collective will of the Soviet people, and to voluntarily join these farms, which they wouldn't, because they wouldn't just give up all their property. And the words that Stalin has used in sort of political rallies and conventions and stuff, where he's basically declaring war on the kulaks, are very cleverly worked into the words of the characters in here, the cadres in here. But I wouldn't have known that without the notes. And I think that's what I appreciate, is the fleet-footedness of the writing here. This isn't as uproarious and as funny as the Master and Margarita. It's more subtle, although it's doing a very similar thing. It's a satire of what was going on in Russia at the time. So I was, in the end, I was actually quite impressed by this. The sort of symbolic ending I can't spoil for you, but just to say that Platanov initially was an enthusiastic Bolshevik and became more and more disillusioned as he saw what was happening in the countryside. There's a lot of sort of casual death of the characters, sort of one by one. They sort of almost lay down, they're so exhausted by their labour that many a chapter finishes with them sort of laying down to go to sleep, sort of all hunched up together because of the lack of space. But eventually some of them don't wake up again. They've either been murdered or they've willed themselves to death, or they've just sort of basically starved to death. So I thought this was actually sort of much more effective than I did when I finished reading it. So I gave it 4 stars. I've upgraded it to 4 stars. And on to the Superrationals by Stephanie LaCava. This book didn't work for me at all, I'm afraid. So 2 women in the art world, one who writes art criticism and the other who is basically a patron, has lots of money. They are friends with each other, and they sort of follow each other around sort of, art centres of the world, Paris, London, New York, obviously. And they're always sort of chasing after these men who have basically dumped them, and they're sort of egging each other on by sort of saying, "Oh no, you've got to cut the tie, you've got to let him go for good." And they're doing this to each other, while themselves, in their own sort of desperate relationship, are desperately trying to rekindle, so that the men know exactly what they're doing. They're playing them like fish on a line, and the women know that. The women are aware that's what they're doing, but they still, even though they advise their friend not to succumb to it, they all too easily succumb to it themselves. It's the most unfeminist book I've ever read. There is some good writing in here. I mean, there's some art criticism interspersed with that, and actually that was the best bit. But these 2 characters, these 2 women, was so regressive, really, from what we feel about relationships today. I just couldn't be doing with them at all. You wanted to sort of bang their heads together and say, listen to each other. 2 stars. Donald Antrim, The Verificationist. So this was a jaunty, fun little read that was fairly inconsequential, I felt. So a man has organised for a group of psychiatrists and psychoanalysts after a conference that they're going to go to a Waffle House and sort of all sort of have a social there. And every conversation initially is sort of predatory, that it's all behind the guise of psychobabble, but really, as per Freud, that everything is motivated by sexual desire, so that the men and the women who are talking here really is just a prelude to getting into each other's pants, which I think is a body of theory that we don't really hold much truck by these days. But the guy who's organised it is a bit of a maverick. He's a bit of a loose cannon, especially at sort of social parties like this. And it's starting to get out of hand. And one of the other guys sort of constricts him, sort of stops him about to do something sort of antisocial. And he squeezes him so hard that he sort of leaves his body and he floats above in the room. and that changes obviously the tone of the book, apart from it being surreal in and of itself. But it's no longer about sort of this sort of Freudian, coded language. It's more a sort of a freeing of himself, literally sort of floating freely. But he also has hands up to the waitress, who is, she has all these dreams and stuff, and knows she's stuck in this dead-end job. So by joining him floating above the room, that somehow that's going to empower her and liberate her. And then we get another guy who hangs on to her. It's all a bit silly, really. And as I say, it becomes rather inconsequential. It's a perfectly pleasant read, 3 stars. And on to Eggshell by Victoria Kenneficke. So I read her debut collection last year called Eat or We Will All Starve. I think that's what it's called. And there was sort of, what I liked about that in particular, and I'll post my link to my review of it, was how the functions of eating and the notions of nourishment were explored from many different angles, many different facets within that. And again, we have sort of repeated motifs here. We have lots about swans. We obviously have lots about eggs. So in the first half, which is called Egg, that section, we get lots of different takes on eggs, such as egging houses at Halloween, how to make custard, teaching your little girl to break an egg in order to bake for the first time. We get a sort of a scientific study of the effect of temperature on chicks, not chickens, and how if the temperature goes a bit above, how that changes them morphologically, and how if it's a bit lower. And it's looking into causes of death in chickens. So there's all these different sort of, but interspersed with that, as I say, there's the motif of the swan, because the first half of the collection is about miscarriages, about broken eggs, about a broken body, or the perception of a broken body, where the character, and I assume it's Victoria because she's named in the second half of the book, she has a young daughter, but she wants a second child, but it's proving very difficult because of all these miscarriages. And there's some very touching poetry on that. But it's really when we get to the second half, I say half, actually the egg part is 2/3 and the shell part is 1/3 in terms of length. But there's a lot more sort of anger, there's sadness in part 1 because of all these dead children or dead embryos. Part 2, there's an absolute anger and passion, because this is about the collapse of her marriage, because the partner has come out as trans, and although there's no enmity towards the concept of someone changing their sexual identity, when you're married to them, as in here, you feel betrayed. You feel that the whole thing's being built on a lie, that not only is the trans person being lying maybe to themselves, but say it to society by being in the guise of a man, but betraying the wife who has gone into a marriage on the sort of belief that this is a heterosexual relationship. And there's a fantastic poem called The Husband Suit, where it's literally stripping back the suit that was worn at the marriage on the wedding day, to reveal that that's now a costume that is no longer applicable here. There's so much sort of passion and fury in here. It's a terrific collection in that respect. I give it 4.5 stars. And that's it for this week. So till next time, thanks very much.